Hello and welcome to Duxford. You join us at one of the premier events in the airshow calendar. Flying Legends is without doubt Europe's top warbirds show. Over 2 days we'll be seeing some spectacular flying from aircraft of the two world wars, plus some classic piston-engine civilian aircraft. Because at this airshow, the Piston is the star. Jets aren't invited. And here's a look at what's flying today. We'll be featuring the Lysander, with 3 aircraft together for the first time in many years. On the 50th anniversary of the Berlin airlift, the fabulous Constellation, Queen of the Skies. Also from America, the big cats, Tiger Cat, Bear Cat, Hellcat and Wildcat, the cream of US naval aviation. And we'll have bombers too, with the B-25 Mitchell, the Invader, and of course, the Lancaster. Well, that's all coming up later, but we start with the aircraft that Britain loves best, the Spitfire. Well, the show is being opened by no fewer than 10 Spits, so let's join Sean Maffett.
Let's start with a real Spitfire fest. This is the place to do it because in May '98, Duxford hosted a big 60th anniversary bash for the Spitfire. This one is a Mark V. There were more Mark Vs than any other Mark, about 6,500 of them out of a total of more than 20,000. Here's a Mark VIII. Geoffrey Quill, the great Spitfire test pilot, considered the 8 to be the best from the flying point of view. The Mark IX, which actually came out before the Mark VIII, was probably the best all-round Merlin engine Spitfire. This particular one is a very distinguished and battle-scarred veteran. It's one of the first Allied aircraft to land in France after D-Day, and it has several kills to its name. This is a Mark 14. It's longer than the Marks we've seen so far because it was the first with the bigger and much more powerful Griffon engine. It's fast enough to catch V-1 flying bombs. It actually belongs to a Frenchman, Christophe Jacquard, and he's been able to bring it over to England this year after a change in the international regulations. A change that for once actually made one country's controls acceptable in another. Bravo. And we'll be hearing from Christophe later. So, Spitfires, scramble.
There we go. Great. Tackling out as well.
There are in fact 10 Spitfires in this part of the display. There are 2 Mark Vs, 1 Mark VIII, 5 Mark IXs and 2 14s. Not as many as in May, when there were actually 22 aircraft on display. And all but 2 of them are based here at Duxford. Now you really couldn't see this sort of thing anywhere else. So let's just enjoy the full music of the Merlin and the Griffon engines. And the lead aircraft of this pair is the other Mark 14 and has quite a different sound with that Griffon engine compared to the Merlins.
and you just continue straight before you break 14. Just 2 more passes, 2 more passes.
Spitfire pairs running in for a final loop in front of the crowd, perpendicular.
The aircraft that's always associated with Duxford, the Spitfire, flying here in its 60th anniversary year. Well, over the weekend, more than 30,000 people will have been here at Duxford for this very special show in the aviation calendar. They come from all over Europe, and in fact, there are also many visitors from America. Such is the growing reputation of this truly international event. It's worth remembering, of course, that Duxford was a US Air Force base for much of the Second World War. And many American airmen have returned here in later life to find that many features, like the old control tower, are just as they remember them. These days, it's no longer RAF Duxford. The airfield is now operated by the Imperial War Museum. But this show is organised by the privately owned Fighter Collection, which is based here and which operates many of the aircraft here today. One of the great things about this show is that it always offers something unusual, and this year is no exception. The Westland Lysander entered service in the same year as the Spitfire, 1938, but unlike the Spitfire, very few examples remain in flying condition. Today, for the first time ever, we're going to see 3 Lysanders flying together in formation. I'm now joined by Jean-Michel Legrand of Sabina Airways, actually, who's right, flying this Lysander. Jean-Michel, how did you come to be operating this particular aircraft?
Well, I saw this aircraft operating for 10 years in air shows, and I always was looking to the airplane and following the restoration, and one day they said, okay, if you want to fly it, you can fly it. And they told me, well, 50 years ago you should have 5-minute briefings in a gin. You don't have the gin today, but I give you the 5 minutes briefing, there he is. If you want, take it. And I took her. That's the only briefing I had.
What kind of characteristics does the Lysander have from a pilot's point of view?
Well, it's like the book says, it's the controls are not harmonized. It's a very bad airplane on the ground. It's very difficult. It's a very strange aircraft. The wheels are very close together. The wing is very, very large. It's high. The tail is very big. So all what the plane wants to do is go into the wind.
Don't want to talk the aircraft down because it is a wonderful aeroplane, but there were other problems, weren't there, inherent in its design?
When Admiral Penrose was making the first flight on 15 June 1936, what he saw is that with the horizontal stabilizer, once it was in approach position, and you had to make a go around, the pitch up given by the engine and the pitch up given by the horizontal stabilizer was too big to be counterworked by the elevator. So the plane was going up and up and up and up until stall speed and just fall. So Harold Penrose, who was the test pilot of Westland, just refused to accept the plane. And Westland told him, well, if we have to make the modification, that means make a longer fuselage, we will have about 6 month delay, and we missed the Army contract. So they say we're going to leave it like this and put a placard in the cockpit, which they never did. So between 1936 and 1938, well, they were falling out of the sky all over the place. Mostly in air shows, because the guys were coming and making a low-speed presentation with a go-around, and there it was going. Hop, going up and going down afterwards.
Jean-Michel's Lysander, Lizzie's as they're affectionately known, is the only one of the 3 that has the access ladder for the back cockpit still attached to it. When they were on clandestine operations, delivering and fetching secret agents behind the lines, they would often fly like this so that people could scramble in and out quickly. But unfortunately, the drag of the ladder knocked about 6 knots off the speed. What a splendid sight, 3 Lizzies taxiing out together. And that's a sight that's not been possible for a very long time. It only happens now because the Shuttleworth collection has just taken delivery of the 3rd airworthy Lizzie after its Mercury engine was refurbished by the Aircraft Restoration Company here at Duxford. In fact, this segment of the show celebrates the Bristol Mercury engine, and here are 2 more of them attached to the only flying Blenheim in the world. And this is the newly restored Shuttleworth Lizzie, flown by Dodge Bailey. It's got the squadron markings of a Polish squadron when it was stationed near Strathallan, and that's where this aircraft was also based. And in fact, we'll be joining Dodge Bailey on board the aeroplane in a few moments. Jean-Michel Legrand gets airborne in the Sabina Old Timers aeroplane. Lysander was designed originally for Army cooperation duties in the days before helicopters were generally available, so it was supposed to be very good at flying slowly. It could fly at 60 miles an hour, although, as Jean-Michel was saying, some care was required. But here they are anyway, a lovely Vic of 3 Lysanders. The slow-speed handling of the Lizzie was largely due to those strange wings, with the inboard section of the leading edge actually swept forward, and automatic high-lift slats along the leading edge. And those spats on the wheels could sometimes carry machine guns or even bombs. Now here's an aeroplane that we didn't see take off because it came straight here from the Shuttleworth Aerodrome at Old Warden. But it too has a Mercury engine. It's the only flying Gloucester Gladiator in the world. The Gladiator was the RAF's last biplane fighter, but interestingly, it only flew for the first time in 1936, while the service's first monoplane fighter, the Hurricane, had already flown at the end of 1935. Nonetheless, 767 Gladiators were built, and they went on to perform distinguished wartime service. Bristol Blenheim has a fascinating history. It was designed as a fast executive aeroplane, sort of Learjet of its day. Turned out to be faster than contemporary fighters in 1934, 307 miles an hour on its demonstration flight. So the Air Ministry ordered 1,100 of them. And they went on to serve in all commands of the RAF and in all theatres of the war. Eventually, more than 6,000 of them were built. And this is the only one left flying. Beautifully and painstakingly restored by the Aircraft Restoration Company. And here is an extremely rare, if not unique, sight. 6 Bristol Mercury engines on 5 wonderful aeroplanes in formation. Well, just about in formation. Jean-Michel's Lizzie seems to be having a little difficulty keeping up. Must be that pesky ladder. Now, as promised, we're able to go on board, or at least to have our camera on one of the Shuttleworth Lizzie's wing struts and join Dodge Bailey.
You can see the constant control activity on the stick. It's and on the throttle you can see the left hand moving on the throttle and the RPM varying on the propeller. It's Airplanes don't just sit in formation, you're working hard all the time, and it's what we call in the business a high gain task. I've been left behind a little bit here. I'm on the outside of the turn and I haven't added enough power to make allowance for that, so I've been spat out a little bit, so I've added some power to catch back up before the next flyby. It's quite a big engine. It's around 800 horsepower or so, and it takes a while for it to actually change power settings. So even when I make an input, it will take a while for that to take effect.
And here we are, back on the ground in time to see Dodge Bailey landing the Shuttleworth Collection's newest arrival. Well, Mercury's are radial engines, and most American warbirds have radial engines. But here are two exceptions. These two comparatively slimline aircraft are both powered by Allison V12 liquid-cooled engines. Front, the Curtiss P-40 Kitty Hawk, in the trail position, the Bell P-63 King Cobra. And if you're thinking, like I am, wow, that's pretty neat formation flying, but it's not surprising, because the pilots are Steve Johnson and Guy Bancroft Wilson, and they used to fly together in the Red Arrows at the end of the 80s. They're now flying for the Fighter Collection, the Duxford-based hosts of the Flying Legends show. Steve Johnson really winding the P-40 up to somewhere near its maximum speed of 357 miles an hour. And coming in from the other end, the P-63 King Cobra. Now, this is a very odd aeroplane. It's designed around a big 37mm cannon that fires shells that are about 1.5 inches across. And a gun that size has such a recoil that it has to be on the center line of the aircraft. So it actually fires through the propeller boss, and the breech mechanism is under the pilot's instrument panel. So where's the engine? Well, it's behind the pilot, and it drives the propeller with a long shaft that runs under the pilot's seat and actually through the middle of the joystick. American pilots didn't like the P-63 much. When the gun magazine emptied, the weight and trim change was so great that the aircraft sometimes went into a flat spin. And in fact, the US kept the aircraft out of the front line. But more than 3,000 were sold to the Russians during the war, and they seemed to like them. And Guy Bancroft Wilson seems to be enjoying it, but then he doesn't have to fire the gun. As the P-40 lands, you may be wondering what that nose art is. Well, I'm told it's a tiger's head. And no, I can't see it either. But those are the colours of a US Army Air Force fighter group in the Aleutian Islands in 1943. And as the P-63 lands, you get a good view of the engine air intake just behind the cockpit there. Steve Johnson taxis the P-40 in.
Most of the displaying aircraft here can be seen on the flight line before the show, but not this one. This is the first Lockheed Constellation to visit Britain for more than 20 years. It's been touring Europe to commemorate the 50th anniversary of the Berlin airlift, in which this very aircraft took part. Duxford's runway is a bit too short for the Connie, even at light weights, so it's operating from Cranfield, where the Popular Flying Association rally this year coincides with Flying Legends. Many of the features on this aircraft we'll never see again, like its distinctive triple tail. As its captain explains, there were good reasons for this unusual design.
The airplane was originally developed with only one vertical fin, as most airplanes are. However, to have enough control of the aircraft in case of an outboard engine failure, why, the tail had to be so high that it would not go into a hangar that they had in those days. Remember, this airplane, we're going back to the 1940s. Yeah, so none of the airlines in the world had hangars that would take that large a tail.
The Connie burns 8 gallons of oil an hour. Just watch the left outboard engine as she starts up at Cranfield, dwarfing the other aircraft at the PFA rally. Control checks for the flight to Duxford. It'll take just 8 minutes, but don't forget this is the world's first truly long-range airliner. As much of a leap forward in air travel as the jet age, which was soon to follow.
It was the first high altitude, 20,000 foot airplane, pressurized, long range, 4,300 miles. At that time, airplanes were stopping every 4 or 5 hours to refuel. On any 3,000 mile trip, they had to stop a couple of times at least.
Connie building.
Thank you. The surface wind 295 degrees, 8 knots.
This is really the start of modern aviation, of long range, high altitude, and high speed. This aircraft in the 40s would outrun most fighters of that day. It was a 300-mile-an-hour airplane.
Home-built formation, line up and wait.
Connie, take over right, turn out.
Hey, firm.
Connie, going right.
Connie, on return, when you land, it will be a right turn up 36.
Several people have tried to get air-to-air film of the Connie on this European trip, but until our photo chase Hawk came along, no one had actually managed to catch it. Enjoy. And back at Duxford, there's an air of expectancy. After all, the Constellation is extremely rare. Most people here have probably never seen one flying. As Rob said, it's more than 20 years since a Connie visited a British air show. No one's disappointed though, because here is possibly the most beautiful, big, piston-engined aeroplane there's ever been. Of course, the Connie is not landing because of the short Duxford runway, but it is going to do a low overshoot, a go-round, so we'll get the chance to see the long, stalky landing gear. And those huge barn door-sized flaps on the trailing edge of the wing. The MATS crest proudly emblazoned front and back, Military Air Transport Service, because this aircraft was a C-121, the military version of the Connie. When it was retired from the military, it belonged for a while to John Travolta. He had planned to restore it after it had spent years in the wilderness spraying forests with insecticide. But he never got round to it, and eventually the task fell to the present owner, Vern Rayburn, and what a beautiful job he's done. Well, Sugarland Express sounds like it ought to be a name for a Connie, really, doesn't it? But the very different purpose of this aircraft is indicated by 8 of those .5-inch machine guns in the nose. It's a light attack bomber, the Douglas A-26 Invader. Slightly bigger in scale, but still twin-engined, the North American B-25 Mitchell. This is classed as a medium bomber. And although this is clearly smaller than either of the two bombers, it was the biggest and heaviest fighter with a single piston engine, the Republic P-47M Thunderbolt, otherwise known as the Jug. The Mitchell appropriately reflected in the sweeping glass front of the grand new American Air Museum at Duxford. The Invader was designed, built and produced entirely during World War II, but such was its success that it was still being used in the 1970s. The Jug indicating here its main and highly successful role as an escort fighter for long-range bomber sorties. It was the most numerous American fighter ever produced. More than 15,500 were made, and they served well into the 1950s with many different air arms. The Mitchell proved very popular during the war. 11 air arms operated them, including the Royal Air Force, under lease-lend arrangements. This was one of those. It's still in RAF colours with the D-Day invasion stripes. From American bombers and an escort fighter to the main heavy British bomber of the Second World War. 4 Rolls-Royce Merlin engines accelerate the Lancaster down the runway. And although this magnificent airplane appears at all the big British air shows, it's one of only 2 Lancasters still flying. That's out of a total of 7,374 of them, built between 1941 and 46. The other one belongs to the Canadian warplane heritage in Hamilton, Ontario. But this one still flies for the RAF. It's the flagship of the Battle of Britain Memorial Flight. Another of the Memorial Flight aeroplanes. This is one of their 2 big Griffon-engined Mark 19 Spitfires. In wartime service, the Mark 19 was a high-flying, unarmed reconnaissance aircraft. At 26,000 feet, it could manage 446 miles an hour, but it could also get up to 40,000 feet. And even at that rarefied height, it could still cruise at 370 miles an hour. To cope with the rigors of high-altitude flight, it had a pressurized cockpit. Early marks of Spitfire had been the public heroes of the Battle of Britain, but the real workhorse of the battle was the Hurricane. At the start of the battle, there were 29 Hurricane squadrons compared to 19 Spitfire squadrons. This Hurricane is a Mark II version, and like the contemporary early Spitfires, it's powered by a Rolls-Royce Merlin engine. It was actually the last of 14,533 Hurricanes to be built in 1944. But these markings are of number 261 Squadron when it was defending the island of Malta in 1940. The Lancaster's back with its bomb doors open to demonstrate its capacious bomb bay. It was the Lancaster that carried the huge 22,000-pound earthquake bomb. That was nearly 10 tons in weight. Memorial Flight's display ends with the spine-tingling formation flypast. Spitfire on the Lancaster's right wing, Hurricane on its left.
The Battle of Britain Memorial Flight, among the regulars at Flying Legends. Well, besides enjoying the flying display, visitors to Duxford can always take a look at what's going on in the many hangars. The fighter collection, which runs the show, has some of the rarest combat aircraft in the world and is always on the lookout for other gems to restore to flying condition. Its owner and benefactor, Stephen Gray, flies all the aircraft himself. It's his passion which has made all this possible.
In pretty advanced stages of restoration, we have a P-40B Tomahawk, which is a unique airplane recovered in Russia. And that airplane is in final stages of restoration, not here in the Imperial War Museum, but with a good friend of mine in America called Steve Hinton. And then we have a Sea Fury here in advanced stage of restoration, a Gladiator, and a Beaufighter.
Just give us a little rundown of how that came to be here.
That particular airplane had been in combat in the northern area of Australia, and had shot down a Zero, and a second Zero had actually shot it down. And it had landed alongside a beach. And was recovered after many years by an enthusiastic group in Australia who simply put it to one side in the hope that they could tinker with it one day. And we had some considerable period of negotiation before we were able to get it out.
So it's in the hangar now. How long before we see it flying?
Well, it'll fly when it's ready. And I can't tell you when that's going to be because it is a massive project. But I certainly hope it's flying before I'm in my bath chair.
And Stephen, also just tell us about what you're flying in the display here this weekend.
I've been allocated a Bearcat to fly, which is really hard government work. I'm very happy to fly any of them. That's the whole point of the exercise, and that's a delightful airplane.
So, following Stephen's lead, here is a coterie of cats, a kindle of kittens, a flight of felines, and starting with the muscular, flexing biceps of the tiger cat. Taxiing in the background there, the Hellcat. Somewhat less elegant, more like a tubby, overweight kitten, the Wildcat. And here, blunt, purposeful, and extremely quick and agile, the Bearcat, Stephen's choice. It's an interesting group of aircraft. They're all carrier-based, and they span the last and the ultimate 8 years of piston engine fighter development, from the Wildcat, which first flew in 1937, through to the Bearcat, which arrived just too late to make the Second World War. Bearcat was, though, the fastest and most manoeuvrable piston engine fighter there's ever been. They all belong to Stephen Gray's fighter collection, and Stephen has the ambition to have an example of all the main Allied fighters that were operational during the Second World War.
Always a delight here at Duxford, the big cats. Well, still on a nautical theme, the show brings together two aircraft which seldom fly together. These swordfish come from the Royal Navy Historic Flight, based at Yeovilton. To preserve engine hours, they normally operate singly, and for much of last year, one of them was grounded by an engine problem.
We couldn't get it to run correctly at all, and when they eventually found out the problem, it was the carburetor jets were incorrectly fitted from the factory. I think we got a service bill just at the end of August, and it did a month, and then it was then stripped for the winter. So yeah, it didn't do a great deal last season.
One of the best parts of their show comes before the aircraft even move. The Pegasus engine has no self-starter. The display itself is fairly sedate. In its wartime carrier-based role, the old swordfish had to put up with grave indignities. Not so today.
You can't actually throw this aircraft around too much without doing a great deal of damage. So we tend to not pull a great deal of G, and we need 30 degrees nose up, so 45 degrees angle of bank. And basically people just come to see it and hear it really, not to see it being doing aerobatics and things.
Swordfish was affectionately known as the string bag, and they really do look like aeroplanes from another age, don't they? They started out in 1933, and the Royal Navy ordered them in 1936. And when you see these pictures from our onboard camera here, it turns out that the shutter speed of the camera is almost the same as the propeller speed, which is why that propeller appears to have stopped. But fortunately it hasn't actually, it's still keeping going, I'm glad to say. And believe it or not, they were still serving at the end of World War II, by which time more than 1,700 of them had been delivered. Not surprisingly, I suppose, Stringbag was the last biplane to see active service. The contemporary Jane's All-the-World aircraft, though, did say it became one of the most versatile aeroplanes under the rigours of modern warfare. Perhaps their most famous operation was a night raid by Swordfish with bombs and torpedoes which virtually destroyed the Italian fleet in Taranto harbour. That was November 40. In May 1941, the battleship Bismarck was sunk in the Atlantic, having first been disabled by Swordfish from HMS Victorious and Ark Royal. And later, after the Ark had been sunk herself, her squadrons were flying from Manston in Kent, and they attacked the Scharnhorst, Gneisenau and Prince Eugen pocket battleships as they made their channel dash. All 6 aircraft were lost on that occasion. 13 of the 18 crew were killed, and Lieutenant Commander Esmond got a posthumous VC. Of course, one of the great things about the slow speed, 103 miles an hour, of the string bag is that you can stand up in the back of it, fly a white ensign and salute as you go by. Thank God for the Royal Navy.
Well, there are some more classic Navy aircraft coming up, including 3 Vought Corsairs. One of them's being flown by a man who's come all the way from New Zealand just for this show, though he's a 767 captain, so I guess he doesn't have to pay the full fare. Keith Skilling just loves the Corsair.
It's a wonderful aeroplane. It was almost the ultimate fighter towards the end of the war, certainly in the Pacific region. It's got wonderful power, delightful controls, beautifully harmonised controls. So even at very high speed, the aeroplane is still very, very light and controllable compared to some other earlier fighters.
What are you doing in the display today?
Well, today there's 3 aircraft. I'm flying Stephen Gray's aeroplane. There's one from France and the old Flying Machine Company Corsair. There'll be 3 of us. We'll be operating overhead 2 Avengers and Catalina, sort of a Pacific type scene, and we'll just be doing a full aerobatic display in what we call loose line astern. So it's nice and safe and high and fast.
It's extraordinary that a folding wing can be so strong, but as Keith demonstrates, there's nothing to it, really.
This bolt here runs through to here, holding this in place. So that, as we call it, that's what we say is the Jesus nut. I mean, the wing is held on by this bolt here and that bolt there, and that's about it, really. And it's nice and strong. It'll take 7G. So.
Well, the dark blue of these great butterflies lazily stretching and unfolding their wings is, of course, navy blue, because as we've heard, this is another bit of the show that's all about maritime air power. And of course, keeping aeroplanes on board ships means that they have to take up the absolute minimum of precious hangar space, and hence those folding wings of the 3 Corsairs at the front. Rather less butterfly-like, but still naval in purpose, the TBM Avenger. And making up the maritime set for the time being, an aeroplane that must rank high in the competition for the ugliest there's ever been, the AD-4 Sky Raider. The graceful crank-wing Corsairs take off first, tucking their wheels asymmetrically away. Next, it's the tubby Avengers, and you wonder how they ever managed to take off from an aircraft carrier. But they did, and in fact, after a disastrous introduction to combat in the Pacific War, when 5 out of 6 were destroyed by the Japanese, Avengers went on to become the Allies' most successful carrier-borne torpedo bombers of the war. But here are the Corsairs in a sort of battle formation for their main job as fighter bombers. More than 12,500 of these were turned out between 1942 and 1952. These particular aircraft are in the colours of the US Navy, the Royal Navy and the Royal New Zealand Navy. France and several South American countries also operated them. Of Corsair was originally designed to counter the famous Japanese Zero fighter, which wreaked such havoc on the US fleet in the early days of the Pacific War. When it first flew in 1940, the Corsair was the fastest and most powerful fighter ever built. Top speed was 417 miles an hour, and that made it the first US warplane to exceed the magic figure of 400. And here, in some visual contrast, are those less than graceful Sky Raiders. The looks belie the success, though. Sky Raider was designed as a dive bomber and a torpedo bomber. Came into service with the US Navy just after the war, when aircraft production runs everywhere were being drastically cut back. Not the Douglas Sky Raider, though. This aircraft went on to become an amazing multi-role performer. Its jobs included electronic warfare, anti-submarine operations, airborne early warning, low-level ground attack, and even transport, with 12 seats inside that thick fuselage. There was even a nuclear bomber version. It remained in US service for 27 years, including in Korea and Vietnam, and it also served with the British Royal Navy and the French Air Force, as well as many other smaller air arms. And seeing these three together reminds me of the great strength of this Flying Legends show. I can't think of another show where you can see these 2- and 3-ship formations of wonderful old warbirds like these. Of course, the big difference between all these American aircraft and the British single-engine planes is that these all have radial engines, which means they have to have that big cross-section blunt front end, as opposed to the longer and more streamlined V12 engines like the Merlin. Anyway, back to that Avenger torpedo bomber. Avengers were also long-lived. They were still in service with the Royal Navy as late as the mid-50s. Ironically, this one, in Royal Navy colours, lives in France. They also remained in long-term service with the French Navy, as well as the Japanese and Dutch armed forces. And rounding off this feast of American naval air power, the two Avengers join formation with the lovely Catalina flying boat, or more properly for this particular mark, amphibian. And here an almost ethereal view from our camera on board the Catalina, and the slow motion shot towards the Avenger. Of course, unlike the rest of the aircraft in this naval segment, the Catalina could not land on a carrier, but it could be land or water based. It was a long-range maritime patrol aircraft, that's to say it was used for bombing, torpedo carrying, convoy protection, reconnaissance, and of course air-sea rescue. Particularly good at that because it could land on the water in the days before there were helicopters. And it's the water that causes those engines to be mounted so high up, so they keep as dry as possible. And notice the big observation blister on the side. On some models, that was a gun position. More pictures from our Hawk chase aircraft here. And on the side of the Cat, almost looking like a lifebelt on a boat, one of the main undercarriage wheels, tucked up for flight, but uncovered. It's older than the other aircraft, first flew in 1935, and it clocked up 30 years of service after that. It was built for the US Navy as the consolidated Vultee PBY-1, but in 1939 the RAF accepted the PBY-5 version and they christened it the Catalina. Even the US Navy eventually accepted the name. So here's the land part of the undercarriage coming down for the landing at Duxford. If it were landing, or more properly alighting, on water, the complete wingtips fold down to become floats. And of course that underside of the fuselage is clearly boat hull shaped. There are plenty of Catalinas left in North and South America, and 4 in Europe, of which this is one. It's Duxford based and it's in RAF Coastal Command colours. And isn't it lovely?
Well, the man flying the Catalina is Keith Sissons, who's one of the best-known pilots on the display circuit. For years, he's been flying the famous Sally B, But Keith recently left the B-17 team after disagreements with the aircraft's owner, Ellie Sallingboe. Sally B missed this show because of an engine problem, but at last year's Flying Legends, its display was spectacular, although Keith might not have intended it that way.
Yes, that was entirely my fault, because I was doing an intentional short landing on the grass, because we got a grass field display to do at some future date, and it was a question of just checking out a grass landing, and I wanted to do it particularly short, and I was quite happy to straddle the taxiway just short of that grass runway, but I hadn't allowed for the little bit of grass slope up to it, and we struck just this little piece of slope, which is like hitting a ski jump, as it were, and it sort of threw the airplane into the air. But again, it's like a big chipmunk, the B-17, so quite controllable and recoverable. As you say, we sort of managed to land it on 3 points quite successfully after that.
A mistake, perhaps, but it must be said that Keith's immaculate recovery shows what a good pilot he is. It won't be long before we see the B-17 again, but Ellie is now said to have banned grass landings to avoid unnecessary stress on the undercarriage.
As for the Catalina, Flying Legends was to be its last major display before a tragic accident. 3 weeks after the show, the aircraft was carrying a party of VIPs when it flipped over whilst trying to alight on the Solent. The aircraft sank with the loss of 2 passengers, one of whom was the Mayor of Southampton. Keith Sissons was not flying at the time. This Catalina had been the only airworthy example in Britain. As we recorded this, the cause of the accident was not known.
Now, one welcome sight at this year's show is the participation of several French aircraft, like one of the Corsairs that we saw in that Navy display. In recent years, there have been bureaucratic problems between the French and British authorities over airworthiness requirements. That's kept the French away from shows like Flying Legends, but now the problem seems to have been resolved.
It's misunderstanding, really, because the English wanted to be sure that the French warbirds were maintained the same way you maintain yours over here. And it was just a matter of someone in France writing the good letter. And it took about a year to do that. Now the problem is solved, and hopefully you will see more and more French planes in your air shows.
Yes, it's the last thing that pilots and warbird people want to get into, isn't it? Regulations and red tape.
You need regulation and red tape, but I mean, you have to consider warbird pilots as grown-ups. They won't fly into oily things or rubbish, you know. They know what they are doing with their warbirds, so they want to fly in safe plane. So you have to trust them, really, I guess.
Well, the new understanding between the British and French authorities has opened the door to people like Christophe Jacquard, who owns several warbirds. He was flying one of the Mark 14 Spitfires we saw earlier. The aircraft once lived here at Duxford, but it joined Christophe's collection in an exchange deal.
And it was in my mind to have a Spit, so I decided to trade my P40 to have a Mark 14, but I wanted to have the big engine and with a 5 blades prop and a high-back version. That's why it was so difficult to find, and I decided to trade my P40.
The Spitfires, of course, are much rarer in France, so Christophe's aircraft has been in much demand.
As you speak about Spitfires, everybody wants to have a Spit in air show, so it's very easy for me to make business with a Spit in France.
Well, it's very nice to see the French this year, but here's a team that comes every year. And if you think they look, well, a bit, shall we say, distinguished, that's because they are all very senior pilots. And this is what they do. They do it at about 20 shows every year. They have nothing particular in common apart from their love of their Tiger Moth biplanes, and as one of them says, their senility. But they've been providing this wonderful entertainment since the mid-1980s.
Tigers, mid-right, turning right, go! Tigers, feathers, feathers, go!
They are, of course, the Diamond 9 team of individually owned Tiger Moths. As you can hear, their call sign is Tigers.
Tigers, braking, braking, go! Brake, go! Left, go!
Although the Diamond 9 give their time and their aircraft flying hours, they still wouldn't be able to achieve this lovely piece of nostalgia without generous sponsorship. They get that from Olympus cameras, Castrol oils and Pooley's flight guides. I suppose for a lot of people, the Tiger Moth epitomises the 1930s and the fun of the aviation scene then. Between 1931 and 46, nearly 9,000 Tigers were made. During the war, they were virtually all used for basic flying training for the British and Commonwealth Air Forces. Charlie Shea Simmons here, a very friendly man. There are actually still something like 200 of these aircraft registered in Britain. And of course, like aerobatic teams the world over, the Diamond 9 have a spectacular photogenic finishing break.
Tigers, Brake, start!
So you are looking ahead, keeping the speed back, keeping it very close on our jacket front of you, landing on set to here, and you'll see the first three aircraft, because there's a lot of crew here, so there's a red taxi for the before they
One aircraft sadly missed on the display circuit is this German Messerschmitt Me-109, seen here at last year's Flying Legends show. Owned by the Ministry of Defence, Black 6 was due to retire from active duty despite a campaign to keep it flying. Then, in what was to have been its last show, the aircraft developed engine problems. The resulting forced landing caused substantial damage. The accident report pointed to mishandling of the cooling system. Black 6 will be repaired, but it now seems most unlikely that this rare aircraft will ever fly again. Here, though, is the next best thing. Not a German Messerschmitt, but a Spanish one, built under license. After 5 years in restoration, it's now back in the air.
It's a 109 G2, but with a Merlin engine fitted on the front. And that was done by the Spanish Air Force after the war, when the Messerschmitts that they'd had delivered to them by the Germans, the engines never actually turned up for them. So they fitted a Hispano-Suiza motor, which was no good. And then, having run them like that for a few years, they, after the war, bought a job lot of Merlins and re-equipped the whole fleet with Merlins.
So, I mean, it's genuine from that point of view. It's never had a Daimler-Benz engine.
That's right. The only thing is, it should really be in Spanish Air Force markings. But, of course, I flew for a couple of years with a late series Daimler-Benz engine that had been refitted onto a Spanish aeroplane. And I have to say, with the build standard of the Daimler-Benz engines at the end of the war, the metal was horrible because the factories had been bombed and all the rest of it. And we had nothing but terrible troubles with it. In fact, I had 4 real forced landings with it in only 40 hours of flying. So, you know, that's not conducive to your health when you're flying around in air shows and it.
Well, what about the aircraft as an aircraft to operate? Compare it alongside the Spitfire. How do they compare, the two of them?
This is a very fine fighter. It's fast, turns very well, it's maneuverable, it's a good airplane. The problem comes with operating it is landing and taking it off. It's extremely difficult, and there's no, I'm not making any exaggeration. You're always a little bit nervous when you go flying in one of these, and if you're not, you're foolish because you'll end up wrapping it up. And I believe it's a fact that during the war they built over 30,000 of these, and 1/3 of them were destroyed in landing and taking off accidents. Quite extraordinary, really. It's more your favorite aircraft when you've landed it and you're sitting having a beer looking at it. And in fact, Reg Hallam, who used to fly for us, very famous test pilot, group captain, he used to fly these, and whenever he'd finish flying it, he'd walk away, pause at about 50 feet, turn and look at it, and he'd say, "You didn't get me this time, you little bastard." And so I feel the same way.
Well, he may have another chance to feel that way, because although this next section is devoted to the Hawker Mark, you never know who may be lurking up sun, ready to bounce you when you least expect it. And it could be, it just could be, that Messerschmitt, the 109 with Obersturmbannführer Hanna at the controls. So, Achtung, you Hurricane pilots. So here's the pair of Hurricanes, one Mark 12, meaning it was made in Canada, and one Sea Hurricane, the naval version of the famous fighter. And they're out on patrol. Thing is, I'm not entirely convinced they're keeping a good eye out behind them. And obviously they can't hear the audience, which is all calling, "Behind you!" Uh-oh, I told you. Still, at least they've realised, belatedly. Now it's just a question of trying to use their numerical advantage to turn the tables on the Obersturmbannführer and get into a good firing position behind him. A lot of twisting and turning goes on. The two aircraft types are pretty closely matched. The Messerschmitt is slightly faster than the Hurricane, but the Hurricane has the edge in manoeuvrability and also in visibility from the cockpit. And the Messerschmitt's guns are better than early marks of Hurricane, which has 8 machine guns to the Messerschmitt's 2 cannon and 2 machine guns. The cannon, of course, being far superior because they've got explosive shells. And yes, they've done it. The Hurricanes have got on the Messerschmitt's tail. I think that wing waggling is an "I surrender" sign. All's well that ends well. So now we can get on with the rest of the Hawker segment in the show. Hurricane, designed by the great Sidney Cam, was the RAF's first 8-gun monoplane fighter. It followed a distinguished line of between-the-wars Hawker biplanes, like the graceful Hart and this, the elegant Hind bomber. This is the only remaining example of the Hart and Hind dynasty that's still flying, and it's lovingly looked after by the Shuttleworth collection at Old Warren. Its svelte shape is partly because it has a V12 liquid-cooled engine, which is slimmer than the air-cooled radials. And this engine is in fact the Rolls-Royce Kestrel, and that's the direct predecessor of the famous Merlin, which powers the Hurricane as well as the early marks of Spitfire and the Lancaster. But later on, after the Hurricane, Hawkers changed their allegiance from inline engines to the big Bristol Centaurus radial air-cooled engine, for this, the Fury. It was a controversial decision, but with the Land and Sea Fury versions, they had a great success on their hands. After the Second World War, they sold plain Land Furies to Iraq and Egypt and Pakistan, and Sea Furies to Britain, Canada, the Netherlands, Burma, Cuba, and other countries, including Australia, which is where this one comes from. Sea Furies acquitted themselves well in Korea, even managing to shoot down some jet MiG-15s. Now the Bearcat, the US contemporary of the Fury, joins in the fun. Interesting to compare the two aircraft. Similar top speeds, around 450 miles an hour. From similar size engines, 2400 horsepower from the Bearcat's Pratt & Whitney engine, and roughly the same from the Bristol Centaurus engine in the Furies. And those are the markings of the Iraqi Air Force.
One thing that surprises first-time visitors to Flying Legends is just how many aircraft get in the air at once. A little later, we'll be seeing the grand finale, or Balbo, with 36 aircraft in formation. But many of the individual displays are very busy. It looks like a tough job for the volunteer controllers. In fact, they don't have that much to do. At all Duxford shows, radio calls are kept to a minimum. Remember that most of these aircraft are from an age when light signals were the order of the day.
The aircraft, or the whole show side of the aircraft, is scripted and organised by the display organisers, and they brief themselves. And all we do is listen out on the display frequency and listen out for any flight safety problems, and if any occur then we butt in. Otherwise, basically they get on with it on their own, and we give them the surface wind and the pressures. They know what's going on because they briefed all their manoeuvres prior to the start of the show. We look, and if it looks like there's anything overtly dangerous, then we will butt in and say so.
One of the least structured parts of the show is the display by 8 North American Mustangs. And for this part of the show, we're going to be flying in the display with Paul Bonham, or at least our onboard camera is. Paul's day job is flying for British Airways.
We took off from the grass, which the Mustang is very happy with a little bit of flap, 20 degrees of flap. It, as you'll see in a second, gets airborne very quickly. Norman there on the left should get airborne just a little bit before me. I'm just using 45 inches of manifold pressure here, which is not the maximum. You can actually use 60 as the maximum, but obviously you need to give the chaps taking off next to you a bit of a chance, and that's what we briefed to use. By now I should think we're just to the south of the airfield. You should just see the airfield coming into view now. There it is. And by now we're probably doing 280 knots, and then at the bottom over the threshold of the runway in excess of 300 knots. Speed for the sequence we were flying is not critical because we were just flying fairly simple wingovers. There's Duxford Village, which we missed. Over the motorway, down the runway here. The other 6 are in trail. You may see them in a minute when we're pulling up. Pulling up now, about 3G there, nice and gentle for the guys behind. And you can just see a couple of aeroplanes behind following, quite spaced out there by the looks of things. Back in towards the centre of the airfield, towards the windsock, which we were using as a turning point. Now we're pulling up on the second part of the wing over for a derry turn. This is where you roll underneath to go back to the left. So in other words, if you're rolling right, you end up turning left. So named after John Derry, who flew lots of air displays in the sort of 50s, and that was his party piece. The guys should have all done a derry turn behind me.
Well, we'll leave Paul Bonham and the rest of the Mustangs as they hang about waiting for 28 other aircraft to get fired up, taxi out and take off to join them. Then we'll see the traditional finale to the Flying Legends show, the great 36 aircraft Balbo. The Balbo named after the Italian Lieutenant Colonel Balbo, who flew big formations of seaplanes across the Atlantic between the wars.
Green 1.
1, 2, 3, 4.
And red leader, blue leader's getting a bit hot.
Okay, Spitfires are going to roll now, and B-25 Invader, keep out of the way.
Right.
Slight change of plan required there because Spitfires don't like sitting on the ground for too long with their engines running. They tend to overheat, so they're getting a little bit of extra priority over some of the aircraft. So here it is, the unique Flying Legends 36 aircraft Balbo. There surely can't be another show like Stephen Gray's Flying Legends. This year, the whole circus went round twice, and then it was time for them all to split down into their smaller formations and do their run-in and break. So, I'll shut up and let you savour the music of the Duxford Big Pistons.
Well, that Balbo with those 36 vintage aircraft in formation brings to a close another magnificent display here at Duxford. I think it's fair to say that no other show could bring together quite such a remarkable collection of historic aircraft. Well, I hope you've enjoyed the magic and the memories that these wonderful machines have brought to the skies over Cambridgeshire in a fitting tribute to all those flying legends. From Duxford, goodbye.